Welcome, everybody. My name is Aristotle Papanikolaou, and together with George Demokopoulos, I'm the co-founding director of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center. Before we introduce the topic, I just want to invite all of you to visit our center's website at fordham.edu/orthodoxy, where you can find the many various things that we do there. And of course, you can also find our events and other material at publicorthodoxy.org, which is run by our center. So that's publicorthodoxy.org. This will be posted on our YouTube website. And of course, we invite you to, like things if you're so moved by the content. But today we're here to talk about what's happening in Georgia and in Serbia. There have been protests, primarily run by the youth, by young people. We have with us two people who are more than qualified to really give us their sense of what's happening there, to give us some context about, how these protests have emerged. And of course, we want to also talk about how it is that perhaps the church, Orthodoxy in general, is somehow playing a role in these particular protests and in some of the events happening in Serbia and Georgia. So I want to introduce our speakers. We have with us Dr. Davor Džalto, who's a professor of religion and democracy at University College Stockholm and president of the Institute for the Study of Culture and Christianity. His research focuses on the exploration of human freedom and creativity as metaphysical, political, and aesthetic concepts. As the author and editor, he had published more than 20 books and over 100 scholarly studies, essays, and op-eds. Among his most recently published books are Beyond Capitalist Dystopia, Rethinking Freedom and Democracy in the Age of Global Capitalism, and Anarchy and the Kingdom of God, from Eschatology to Orthodox Political Theology and back, which I'm really proud to say that book is in our center's book series, Orthodox Christianity and Contemporary Thought, with Fordham University Press. In addition to his academic work, Dr. Džalto is also a practicing artist specializing in painting and printmaking. We also have Guram Luzmanashvili, who received the Bachelor of Theology from Tbilisi Theological Academy in Tbilisi, Georgia, of course, and a Bachelor of Theology from the Department of Theology at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens in Greece, of course. He also holds a master's degree in applied Orthodox theology from the University of Baraman in Lebanon. And he is now a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Catholic Theology at the University of Vienna, of course, in Austria. And his thesis title is Joseph Stalin and the Orthodox Church of Georgia. He's also an affiliated lecturer in modern Orthodox theology, political theology, and the Orthodox Church in Soviet and post-Soviet era at Sultan Saba Orbeliani University in Tbilisi, in Georgia. Thank you both for joining us. Before I begin with questions, I do want to encourage the audience to offer questions of their own throughout the webinar. There is a Q&A function, and I will be moderating that Q&A function. So again, I do want to invite the audience to offer their own questions and comments through the Q&A function throughout this webinar. So why don't we begin with Guram? Because I think chronologically, actually, the protests that we're talking about chronologically began in Georgia. That maybe one influenced the other, maybe not, but that's something we can discuss. But Guram, why don't you first give us, a sense of context, right? Just give us a sense of how this happened, how it's emerged, a sense of context, perhaps even what's happening, where we're at today with these protests.
Thank you for your kind introduction and a warm welcome to everyone joining us today. And I'm truly honored to be here, and I'm excited to dive into this important topic with all of you. What about the question? Yeah, you are correct there, Telly. It started in Georgia in 2023. And why? Because everything was happened after the war in Ukraine. Let's say after the second war in Ukraine or after Crimean annexion in 2022. Why? Because something happened in Georgia, and then whole situation got changed. Everything was started by so-called foreign agents law, which was decided to receive from the side of government, and then electoral disputes and countries fraud pass toward European Union integration. So, and this period also saw a complex interplay between political actors, civil society, and of course, Orthodox Church of Georgia. So everything was started, as I mentioned, in 2023 March, when the ruling party of Georgia, so-called Georgian Dream Party, introduced a highly controversial foreign agents law, which triggered widespread protests across Georgia and even outside of Georgia. Citizens and civil society organizations view this law as a direct threat to democratic freedoms and an obstacle to Georgia's long-standing aspirations for EU membership. And also public outcry was so intense that the government was compelled to withdraw this law shortly after its introduction. But despite prior assurances that the law would not return, the Georgian ruling party reintroduced the legislation in early 2024. It was April or May, and the parliament passed the law and overriding the presidential veto, and it came into effect August 2024. And this reignited mass protest with tens of thousands taking to the street once again in opposition and etc. After this, also response from European Union was more or less swift. Although Georgia had been granted EU candidate status in December 2023, the passage of the law led the European Union to freeze accession talks and suspend key financial assistance, which for Georgia is really great deal because, as you know, Georgia is not a very rich country for its natural resources. And EU officials stressed that the law was detrimental to Georgia's progress toward membership and called for its repeal. Then was also a very important event, namely in October 2024, we had parliamentary elections. And after the elections, the political tensions further intensified. The still ruling party of Georgia, so-called Georgian Dream Party, claimed victory with approximately 54 or 55% of the vote. But however, opposition parties and international observers and just civil society reported widespread irregularities of such kind of elections. And then we already had second let's say second part of the protest in Georgia, still mass demonstrations nationwide, inside and outside of Georgia, in front of embassies of Georgia in European Union, or I guess even in US, in Great Britain, etc. And protesters demanding it recount new elections. Amidst the unrest, the Prime Minister of Georgia, Mr. Irakli Kobakhidze, announced a postponement of EU accession talks until 2028. And this move widely seen as a signaling to shift away from Western alignment. And then we had also third phase of the protest. Namely, it can also be said that European Union and United States expressed serious concerns regarding the electoral process, and the government crackdown on protesters. Demonstrations persisted with calls for new elections and renewed commitment of Euro-Atlantic integration. And the government responded with policy actions that led to numerous arrests and injuries, exacerbating the crisis. And if I'm correct, now we have about 60 political prisoners, and day by day situation is
Wow. Mm-hmm.
it's so difficult. Every day we have new court decisions, new laws, so it's like third or fourth part of the protest. When we are speaking about international response, it also must be said that several European countries also imposed sanctions on Georgian officials, which was happened firstly, we have never experienced such kind of thing before, on December 2024. Even United States enacted global Magnitsky sanctions against multiple Georgian individuals and citing serious human rights violations and efforts to undermine democracy.
Is that since the Trump administration? The
No,
United States?
it was December 20. It was 27th of December 2024. It was like last, I guess, last month of Biden's government.
The Biden, but they haven't been rescinded by the Trump administration.
Yeah, for sure.
They're still in effect.
Now you mentioned the Trump's government, and I can recall one important thing that in May. So in this month of 2024, United States House of Representatives passed a bipartisan so-called Megobari Act and for legislation, and it aims to support Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration. And also it imposed sanctions on anti-democratic actors, counter authoritarian influence, and enhance democracy monitoring of and support. So it was, as I mentioned, bipartisan. So I guess in the Senate was about 350 against 40. So more or less it was a mutual agreement from both of sides. One also very interesting event was happening just a few days ago, that Prime Minister of Georgia, Mr. Irakli Kobakidze, published an open letter addressed to US President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. And it's quite a long letter, but it expressed hope that Trump's effort to defeat so-called deep state could renew US-Georgia relations and restore strategic partnership, because between Georgia and US was so-called strategic partnership, which was absent for such kind of protest. And government hoped that after Trump will defeat the deep state in US, then such kind of relations will restore between Georgia and US. And the Prime Minister also emphasized shared ideological positions on issues like war in Ukraine, about US aid, and about some social policies. I would like also to say one thing why such a protest is so important in Georgia, because Georgia's constitutional amendment underscores that country's foreign policy direction, namely its Article 78, and let me read it, quotation: the constitutional bodies shall take all measures within the scope of their competence to ensure the full integration of Georgia into the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So such kind of protest, what's happening in Georgia, has big idea to defend our constitution, because according to constitution, this Euro-Atlantic integration is really big deal. So this legal framework highlights that Georgia's long-term strategic goal of integration into Western institutions. And it's not only just constitution. We can also speak about public opinion which exists in Georgia. For example, in November 2023, we had a survey in Georgia by International Republican Institute, so-called IRI. And according to survey, 86% of respondents are favor for EU membership, and 79% support joining to NATO. So it's quite a big deal here. So what's possible to add that this political unrest in Georgia, which was happening from 2023 to 2025, underscores the deep challenges the country faces in balancing domestic and even political stability, democratic governance, and its Western integration ambitions. And so-called controversial foreign agents law and disputed elections triggered this significant societal backlash and strained Georgia's relations with key Western allies. So now in Georgia we have really very important and let's say interesting polarization between two different groups. And meanwhile, international actors, including parts of Georgian church, which about we will speak later, also play a complex role. And I'm sure that Davor will speak about Serbian protests, but I think there is a difference between Georgia and Serbia that when you look to the protest of Georgia, it carries clear, very clear pro-Western and anti-Russian character, sparked by this controversial foreign agents law, which about we have already spoken. So many young Georgians, my generations, younger than me, etc., they see this law as a threat, as a direct threat to democratic principles and the country's path towards the EU integration. And these demonstrations reflect not only internal demand path toward EU, but also external. And one more thing, maybe from US, maybe from other parts of the world, European Union is one thing, and US is another, and Great Britain is a third one. But from the perspective of Georgia, this European Union and Great Britain and US, everything is like one big thing, and we call it like Western influence or Western values. So this kind of says a very pro-Western character, and I wanted to underline this issue now.
Yeah. Although, I mean, just very quickly, I mean, that could change with Trump because Trump is not necessarily signaling a very pro-European stance. So that could all change with him. But just very quickly, are there still people on the streets?
Yes, in Georgia, in Tbilisi, capital of Georgia, and in Batumi, which is seaside Black Sea, every day there are some protests, some march, etc. But every day until this time, it's about, I guess, 140 days ongoing protest every day, something like this. But anyway, after 28th of October or November, every day we have protests in Georgia. Big cities. If you go to small villages, maybe you don't feel, but in big cities you can feel it.
There's a protest. Okay, Davor, do you want to give us a sense of what's happening in Serbia? How these protests emerged, where we're at today? So why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation and for putting together this this webinar. I think it's extremely important because, as you said at the beginning, not very many news in the West about these democratic processes and movements in Serbia and also in Georgia. So the background is, it's always the question where do we start when providing a background, because all these things, it's in a flux, it's long processes that of course change during the time. I wouldn't go so much far back in history, just to say that Serbia has one regime that would probably, the best way to characterize it is kleptocratic and technocratic at the same time. That, of course, uses different ideological narratives when they need them to justify this position or the other. It's been the current government or one person around him, the whole regime is centered, the president is being in power, performing various duties already from more than 10 years. And during this time, Serbia significantly declined in many ways. There are, of course, some things that also have been improved, the technological development that goes everywhere and so on. But in terms of institutional functioning, there is a serious lack of procedures, transparency, respect for the institutions, basic laws, and so on. What is important? So there is an element of authoritarianism in this regime, but it's not like that it is a brutal dictatorship or anything like that. It is more centered on corrupting people in different places, and then that way, through corruption, actually providing support for itself. Important thing to say is that all this time, of course, one of the major sources of support for the regime have been coming from the West. And traditionally, the West is there, the government of the United States and Brussels administration, the European Union. They rarely support anything democratic. So they like when there is actually someone who's authoritarian or autocratic who actually they can make a deal and then he can do things they are interested in. And they're not interested in democracy anywhere, including their own countries that are becoming less and less free and less democratic day by day. What they are interested in is, for example, mining precious metals, for instance, and using these third or former third world or second world or whatever countries at the periphery of the Western world as colonies. And it's very useful, for example, if Western companies mine here, use dirty technology, destroy Serbian villages, countryside, ecosystems, that is fine as long as those companies and the governments behind them will benefit. So the protests basically come as a result of all these years of corruption, of various types of repression. As I said, it's rarely directly brutal, but there are also those cases when people are in prison and so on. But that's not the primary source of pressure. Institutional failure, lack of democracy, and various kinds of freedom. And this was triggered, the last wave of protests was triggered by one tragedy that happened in North Serbian city of Novi Sad, when part of the train station construction fell and killed together those who died on the spot, and later, as a result of that, 16 people. And this was the trigger. So the protests sparked those massive protests that were organized and still are mostly by students. And one must say that they have done a tremendous job. This has been probably the most democratic outpour of political consciousness in Serbian history. And they're extremely well organized, smart people. I just happened a couple of days ago to give a lecture at the Faculty of Philosophy in Belgrade. I was invited by the students who actually keep all these faculties occupied, so they control what's happening there. Extremely serious people, smart people, well-organized people who are very well aware that you cannot simply side in the fight against this regime. You cannot side simply with the opposition parties, because Serbian opposition has traditionally been hopelessly dysfunctional, corrupt, sometimes indirectly, actually, either because of their incompetence or because they are also in some kind of deals with the regime. So part of that actually is the support for the regime in various ways coming officially from the opposition parties. So students, many of them, I think, understood that very well, that they are alone in this battle, just Serbian citizens and them. The West won't support them or will just support if they have those who make a deal so that Western interests are actually observed if there is a change in the government. They know they cannot count on any other major support from major empires. It is about trying to democratize this country. And in the meantime, of course, it's not only students, many citizens joined, hundreds of thousands of people have been on the streets, and not just in major cities, but even in very small places. So the students managed to actually go on some kind of almost a pilgrimage to different places all over Serbia. And you can imagine that, of course, in Belgrade or Novi Sad, it's a different situation. It's much freer, and you can, of course, say whatever you want and so on. But in smaller places where there is a high concentration of power in local officials that are representatives of the government and the ruling party, it is much, much more difficult. So this is why it's been so important that they have done what they have done. Now we'll of course see how things will develop, because the situation is extremely complicated and there are no simple solutions.
Can you tell us a little bit more though, because a lot has been talked about how in fact the students have organized, right? The way they've allowed for discussions, for debates, everybody to be heard. There's no one leader. Can you say a little, because of course, part of your own work, which we've had some disagreements about, you and I, but part of your own work is on thinking about sort of political anarchy, right? And that relationship to that, the democratic structure. So I think that you've commented on how you kind of see this in action, right? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually, some people have joked about it, that as if the students followed my manual, so reading from what I wrote and then applying it indirectly. And that's why when I read what they do and see
Yeah.
what they do, I just say like, well, how can I not support that? Because it is really going back to the most democratic ways of organizing that we have known in the West, at least, and
Yeah.
that is the anarchist ways, so communal, at a communal level, where there is everyone is invited to participate in those what I call plenums, or but also citizens started organizing in the meantime. So it's not just the students, the citizens at the local level, municipal level, where they come together. It's not related to any political party, and they have been very clear about it, which I think was extremely smart.
Yeah.
So everybody is invited. You directly there, you come together. The students use faculty buildings, and citizens can use local town halls or other facilities, whatever is available in a given context. They elect who's going to be the moderator, who's going to take notes, and then they discuss and organize working groups that are smaller bodies that are in charge of specific questions. So they either representatives for dealing with the media, or for organizing protests, or communicating with other similar communes. So in this sense, it is really reminiscent in some ways of the February Revolution. And that was with an extremely democratizing and liberating potential. And many people, and part of we had those discussions. Very often the question is, when you talk about real democracy, like anarchism, anarcho-socialism, and that kind of things, oh, it's just ideal world, and it's impossible to put it into practice and stuff like
Right.
that. And we see
Right.
now, again, it is very possible. It can be very efficient in many
Yeah.
ways. In other ways, of course, it's not always efficient. Sometimes non-democracy is more efficient. But this is, I think, why. Of course, I mean, if you have a centralized decision making, then you can provide more efficiency, but at the cost of freedom and democracy. And I think this is the reason also why people need to understand that some of these processes take time. And it's not that easy to immediately come up with simple solutions or put something
Right.
into. What is always a danger is not only that people will get tired, it's not only that there are those who would like to infiltrate there and take over those bodies and the whole protests, including the opposition. But it is also that very often these things come to an end because of the tremendous pressure that comes from very powerful power structures. And in the world in which we live today, at least in the West, we have corporate dictatorships, extremely oppressive thing. We have governments that lack legitimacy and democracy in many places. We have the media, corporate mostly, that also exercise tremendous influence and can use simple manipulation techniques that actually can bring down many of those democratizing movements.
And you have a current president in the United States, and I'm just being descriptive here, which is the truth. I mean, you have a current president of the United States whose family has interest in building a huge hotel in Belgrade, so that's not insignificant either in terms of how this is playing out. One last very quick question before I get to the church, Davor. Do the students, because I've been reading about this, do the students have, I've read, and maybe you can tell me I'm wrong about this, but I've read that they've been mostly avoiding making demands. But I've read somewhere recently that they started to make specific demands. Can you kind of comment on that?
Yes, I think that was at the same time the biggest advantage in this first period of protests, and the biggest disadvantage not to have specific claims, because they were like, we want to change the system and we want justice and these kind of things. So we don't want just a regime change. It's not about that. And this is what, because they understood very well that if you use the currently existing structure, that Serbia has hyper capitalism that has been introduced. You have the procedures and the laws that are there, and you have those interests that I talked about, both internal and external, corporate and others. You won't do much good. You will remove one very harmful figure for Serbian society, which is the current president and his corrupt system. But in the long run, you won't be able to do much good. The question, of course, became then, okay, but how do we proceed from there? Because if we want, we need to start somewhere. And the latest proposal is to actually come up with a list that, again, will be democratically decided and will somehow include representatives from all over Serbia, people, which incidentally I also suggested as one option a couple of months ago, that one way to proceed would be to avoid political parties at all. And political parties can be very anti-democratic, despite the liberal paradigms that the only democracy is parliamentary, multi-party democracy, and so on. There are various ways in which that can be done. This is an ongoing process. One proposal is to try to figure out a certain system proportional so that a certain number of people are elected from different parts of Serbia by local city assemblies that are, again, directly democratic, not through some elections or some political parties, for the new parliament that actually could then do some more substantial changes. Other options and proposals were to have a transition government that would just be there to actually enable some fair elections. They were also proposed to have expert government, which students were smart enough to reject in the end, because they have, especially students of the faculty of philosophy, understanding that there is nothing democratic in an expert government. We need really something that would push forward those democratic tendencies and the whole understanding of what it means to participate as a responsible citizen in a political process.
Okay, now for the second part of the program, and then we'll kind of move to some questions from the audience. I mean, since we're an Orthodox Christian Study Center, and not simply sort of a Center for Foreign Policy or anything like that, or the Brookings Institute. I mean, I think we do need to kind of talk about the role of the church, specifically in the institution, but even just orthodoxy in general, because not simply like how is the institutional church, but maybe you can both comment a little bit about how is it that perhaps faith is kind of showing up in the protests, right? So maybe those two angles, perhaps you can, maybe if you can address that. Guram, why don't you go first?
Yep. If you let me, I would like to start from the one question which was written in chat. So question was from Barbara and Dolson about how is Orthodoxy playing a specific role in this development. So the very first thing which I want to know is that I lived about 5 years in Greece, and Greece is really my favorite country. And I think you can also agree with me there is that in Greece, I heard very often that notion of West mostly was affiliated with Catholic Church, with Protestant Church, with Anglican Church, but not with Orthodox Church. So I heard such kind of idea very often. This does not work for the case of Georgia. If we look at the map and if we see where is the location of Georgia, you will clearly see that Georgia is like last Orthodox and last Christian country, even from the west to the east. So if we speak about geographical location, etc., Georgia is not Europe, but Georgia plays as a part of Europe, and one of the main reasons why Georgia claims that it's a part of Europe is that it has Christian faith, Orthodox faith, but Christian faith. Otherwise, we have no other reason. Even in 1990s, one was a very important movement that Europe was from Lisbon, Portugal, to Tbilisi, Georgia. Like this was like a big line of Europe. So even in this sense that in Georgia, young generation or even old generations, they are against such kind of law and they claim that they are part of Europe, means that one of the main role for the decision plays also religion. Otherwise, if you look east, you will see Azerbaijan. If you look north, you will see Chechnya, Dagestan, etc. And so, like more or less in this context, Georgia and Armenia, they are playing pivotal role to like strengthen this kind of border, if it's possible to say about this. So this very first idea which I wanted to share you after your question and after a question on the chat about the involvement of clerics. I would like to divide Georgian clerics into 3 different groups to understand clearly what about I'm speaking. Let's say a first group are Georgian clerics who are ethnically Georgian but belong to other Orthodox jurisdictions, for example, Ecumenical Patriarchate. Many of them I have read their Facebook statements, some of them also been present there. They were very actively involved in this protest, and they said, okay, we need Europe, and etc. Second group are Georgian clerics who belong to Georgian church jurisdiction, but they live in diaspora. For example, I also have some examples. Just several months ago, I remember that it was December, I guess, in the clergy meeting of Georgian Orthodox Diocese of Belgium and Netherlands was convened in Brussels in December 2024, and they issued special communique on the situation in Georgia. And the statement remarked on the importance of acknowledging the protest, that they are not accidental and aged, and the government to engage with us to explain why they resist becoming Russians. So this was written in official statement of Georgian diocese in Belgium and Netherlands. Also, there's another bishop, Saba Inskirveli, who is based in US, and I remember his one statement that no matter what, no law is worth our children getting hurt. So this was done after the protest in Georgia. So the Georgian clerics who belong to the Georgian church but live abroad in US or European Union, they are like, they have more freedom than those who live inside of the country of Georgia. So they express their ideas on those way. But what about Georgian Church and Georgian Patriarchate of Georgia, which is based in Georgia? Officially, church claims neutrality, but many, and even me, perceive it as tacitly supporting to the ruling party of Georgia, and the Patriarchate has emphasized their priorities with the government, including the safeguarding so-called national and religious values and echoing so-called conservative rhetoric, which is quite a big deal in Georgia. And also this stance has drawn criticism from opposition group and from also civil society, who argues that church position lends legitimacy to the government and amid contested elections. And also one more thing, that after the starting war in Ukraine, one of the main idea which you can hear, I guess, every day from the side of government is that we need peace and we are do our best to avoid the war, because if we don't do this, will be same thing in Georgia what's happening in Ukraine. So it's like narrative. We don't want war, we want peace. It's like a main narrative. Of course, everyone wants peace. No one wants to fight directly against Russia. But their whole campaign of elections were based on this idea. And also this idea was quite often proclaimed by the side of church officials. So let's conclude that 3 different groups in Georgia. Those who belong to other jurisdictions are free. They don't have problem to lose their income. They don't have a problem to lose their, I don't know, church or defraud from the church, and etc. Another group which belongs to the Georgian jurisdiction but lives outside, they are also more or less free, and they are very active, involving from social media mostly such kind of protests, and they protest violations against demonstrants. But Patriarchate in Georgia, they claim they are neutral, but if one is able to read between the lines, he will be possible to see that they support the current political course in Georgia, and also it affects that very often Georgia government gives the church, for example, big land, like hundreds of square meters, etc. Yeah. So it's like mutual agreement between the Patriarchate and church inside of Georgia.
What about the faith of the protesters? Any sense of whether Orthodox faith is playing some kind of role in some of the protesters? Many of them, do we see them holding icons at all? How does that work?
No, you can see like more or less it's very secular, but in Georgian protests, you can see one interesting thing, that almost every day there are different type of march. For example, different parts of Georgia, different professions. For example, I've been in march of historians, also philologists had some kind of march. So in such kind of situation, maybe you can find like Georgian minorities, because Georgia is a very small country, but it has Muslim minorities, etc. But if you look at the protests, you can't see any type or any stress of any type of religion, because idea is that, okay, we are a secular country, and so no matter about our faith, we are citizens of this country, so we have shared opinions that our political course is pro-Western and not pro-Russian.
So Davor, building on that point, I mean, I want to hear about the church, right? And also the same kind of question about the, whether the faith is kind of, showing up in the protest. But I also just in general, the role of religion, let's say, I've also heard of that in Serbia, that one of the things happening with the protesters, and especially sort of the anarchic kind of structure in which this is kind of taking place, is that it's actually contributing to people of difference, right? Serbian Orthodox with Muslims who live within Serbia actually talking with each other and coming together and being able to express themselves and be a part of a movement, be a part of is that true?
Yeah, to a great extent. And we have examples that are really important to mention, and it's important that those have happened and continue, I think, to happen, is that students in their those journeys throughout Serbia and toward the protests that are organized in different places, they were joined by other students from different universities, including from the part of Serbia where the highest concentration of the Muslim population in Serbia. So they would join the rest of the students and come to one place during the fasting period for the Muslims. Then the Orthodox Serbs, so to say, and Orthodox students would actually prepare for them
Wow.
meals and everything else, and vice versa. When
Yeah.
they go to their cities, uh, people, Muslim Serbs, so to say, or those who don't identify necessarily as Serbs but are Muslim faith Serbian citizens, they also prepared fasting food for
Yeah.
Serbian students who were fasting during the Great Lent. So this is a major thing, and it shows something that actually has been marginalized over the last decades because of those wars after the breakup of Yugoslavia. And that is that, yes, together with the history of a lot of conflicts and bloodshed,
Yeah.
sometimes religiously inspired or fueled, you have also in the Balkans the tradition of extreme, it's not even tolerance, it's way over tolerance, embrace of other. Uh, between the Orthodox and Muslims and Catholics and so on. So this is I think important to strengthen that this culture of freedom, culture of understanding is something that we should promote, and it goes way above and beyond what is simply the rhetoric of human rights or tolerance. That is, of course, something that we must have as the very minimum, but I think we
Yeah.
should go much, much above and beyond that. Now, going back to the question, this general question about church, to a certain extent, it is the same, that it's very complicated, and Orthodox Church in Serbia is always very diverse. Whatever you want to call it, organization or just
Hmm.
community of believers. Most citizens in Serbia declare themselves as Orthodox. Of course, it's always the question what it means. Is it just merely ethnic identity, traditional, or does it involve something more, some practicing Orthodox believers of some kinds? So, of course, there are no clear boundaries between these different groups. And a lot of people manifestly supported Orthodox believers, supported the protests. What is more interesting is, of course, that there is a support coming from the clerics. Not all, but there are clerics, priests, and sometimes priests deciding on their own, risking much if the bishop is not sympathetic to the protests, to actually openly support students. And even we have cases in central Serbia where the priests, when students would parade or march, so to say, on their way to the protests, that they would come in front of their churches, prepare food, prepare drinks for them, and greet them with icons, with church bells, incense, and so on. And some of the students would also carry icons and all of that. There are even some bishops who supported students. The patriarch remained, for most of the time, wanted to remain ambivalent about it, claiming that the church needs to be above party politics and all of that. He even, at one point, much later in the protests, he said that he supports, just as everyone else, that the claims of the students are just and that he supports it. I can't now provide exact quotation, but he said that he thought supporting the goals of the protests, those justice and freedom and are sensible, and that he of course supported, but then many actions actually spoke otherwise. It's also and it culminated during his visit to Moscow, when he called during the meeting with Putin, and Patriarch Kirill was also there, where he said that what was happening in Serbia was a color revolution.
Yeah, color revolution.
And this is of course something that even if he thinks that this is color revolution and we know what it means, that is not a place to express that.
There is some speculation, to give him the benefit of the doubt. There is some speculation that he did not think that his comments would be public, which means that he wanted to just.
It makes no difference.
Okay.
It makes no difference.
Right.
So what is interesting also, what is happening, and I would just like to add that as another layer of complexity to the whole story and the whole situation, is that because some students, and among those students, let's not also forget the students of the Faculty of Theology in Belgrade, who also joined the protest, and that was much more complicated for them to decide and organize in the same way at the Faculty of Theology than for other students, because of this kind of split loyalty and power organization between the university and the state and the church. In the case of Faculty of Theology, many students express their faith, and as I said, we're fasting and carrying icons and all of that, not seeing, of course, any contradiction or problem there between their identity as Orthodox people and their fight in this very democratic way, the most democratic way, to my knowledge, happening now in the Western world. And they did it in a very, for them, natural way, and that provoked some of those liberal public intellectuals in Serbia, liberal oriented, and of course, let's not forget, this means liberalism as ideology, liberal/capitalist ideology. So from my perspective, it's nothing good about it. Very undemocratic, another kind of non-democratic ideology. But those were actually attacking those students, claim, oh, you are, what are you talking about? What kind of faith? Trying even to insult them as some kind of backward-oriented, anti-modern, anti-something, like if you are enlightened and if you fight for freedom and democracy, you should just forget about it. And
religion,
whatever liberal capitalist.
That happens in the United States too, where but not so much in the civil rights movement of the '60s, obviously, because religion played such a strong role. But over the last 2 decades, in various forms of human rights movements, to claim a kind of religious affiliation almost seemed to be kind of to claim a religious affiliation in support of these movements might provoke some kind of suspicion. So we have this has been very, very helpful, very clarifying and very helpful, and we have actually some pretty good questions that have kind of floated up here. And the one question there's 2 questions here I think they're really interesting. One is, maybe we can take them together. Take these questions together. And I think they all 3 of us can kind of chime in, but they ask us to maybe draw on our historical background, but also I think they ask of us to make some kind of normative claim, right? So maybe take them together. There's a question here that says, does any Orthodox church really have a tradition of opposing government and standing between people or the protesters, right? That's a good question. We know that obviously the church played roles in revolutionary movements against the Ottoman empires, right? Because at least within Greece and the Balkan territories. But in situations where somehow the church has had a privileged position within the state, whether the church has actually done that, right? I know I'm commenting too much here, but there is a sense of, if we look at it, there's a sense of eclectic intervention, right? There's intervention on some issues, but on other issues, there's kind of like, oh no, we have to stay neutral. But then this kind of connects with so that's one question, right? Can we ever, historically, can we really think of a situation where, I mean, unlike in the Catholic Church, with the Polish Church, I mean, with the, especially during, but just one thing, Goran, to connect it to this other question, because I think they go together. One's historical, one's normative. It says here, what are the limits? Are there limits, or what are the limits of ecclesial engagement in political protest, right? Can silence from the church ever constitute a faithful witness, or does it risk becoming a form of complicity in the face of systemic injustice? So, Goran, do you want to maybe try to tackle those two?
I'd like to start from the first one.
Yeah.
About tradition of the protest, etc. Yes, we can find such kind of traditions, but I'd like to speak about Soviet Union, because firstly, I love speaking about Soviet Union. It's interesting thing about tradition. For example, in 1801, independent of Georgian country, or let's say state, if it's possible to say state, was abolished by Russian Empire. In 1811, autocephaly of Georgian Church was also abolished by Russian Empire. And in 1917, Georgian Church proclaimed one more time its independence autocephaly, and in 1918 also Georgian state, let's say, proclaimed its independence. So if you go back to this part of the story, like from 1917 to 1921, we will see that it was not like symphonia like it was in Byzantine Empire between the church and state. Was on one sense like collaboration, but on another side also some kind of debates and speaking, etc. More or less it was a good tradition, but situation got changed from 1821 when Georgia was annexed by Russia, or let's say by Soviet Union. In 1821, Patriarch of Georgian Church was Leonid Okropieridze, who opposed the local Georgian government and also like Soviet government is possible to say. Like Soviet Union, the more accurate word is a bit late, but let's say Soviet Union, not to go very deep. And even after Patriarch Leonid, who died then we had another patriarch, Ambros Sichelaya, who was also very actively opposed against government, etc. But what happened after him in the church? He died in 1927. So from 1821 until from 1921 until 1927, Georgian Church was very actively opposed against government, and at the same time, government was actively fighting against church. It was Trotsky policy and then Stalin's policy. But at the same time, government also created group inside of the church among the bishops who were opposed the patriarch and his supporters. This movement is known as renovation movement or обновленцы movement inside of the church. So after this movement, so government created opposition inside of the church from the synod, or from the bishop of synods, and after 1927, Georgian church became just instrument or just tool in the hand of Soviet government. Okay, using of this kind of tool different times was different. For example, Stalin saw different way, Khrushchev or Brezhnev a different way, but from 1927, it was a tool. But if you go back from 1917 until 1927, it was not so. So if we speak about tradition, or if we need, at least in case of Georgia, to speak about tradition, which we can use as a basement of the protest. Let's use the time from 1917 until 1927. About second question about limits, I would say just one quick remark, and I think Davor will speak more about this. Okay, we know that church, at least in Georgia, is, let's say, is separated officially from the state, so it's independent institution. But also there are some priests, and they are also citizens of Georgia, so they can use their opinions about politics. But, for example, I mentioned that nowadays we have, I guess, about 60 political prisoners in Georgia just after this protest. And many of them are sentenced, I guess, 5 or maybe 7 years to prison.
Wow.
Yeah, for example, today was also important court events in Georgia. There's one journalist, I guess the Amaglobeli is her last name. So now speaking to sentencing like 5 to 7 years. So I guess when church, let's say priests or bishops, are seeing such kind of unjust things, they should protest. Okay, we don't care about which parties they vote. We don't care if they are right, they are left, or maybe they are socialist Democrats. We don't care about this. But when there's like 19, 18, even old people who are such kind of bad situation, I think they should protest. One more thing. I have students on master degree, and just recently, Georgian government passed a law. It's like if you block, it's about demonstration. When you block street, penalty is about 5,000 Georgian lari. And just to compare, what does it mean? Many students in Georgia are working 24/7 in order to earn 700 lari.
Wow.
And I don't have many students, but all of them have such kind of penalty with 5,000 lari. They are trying not to pay, they are trying to protest, etc. But so just imagine you earn 700, let's say dollar, no more, and penalty is 5,000. So I guess when you see such kind of things, there are no limits, no political thoughts, etc. You need to say something. It's like my
word. Davor, you've done some work on sort of the history of politics and orthodoxy, especially it's in your book. And so can you think of a time when Orthodox churches maybe acted the way it should? And but at the same time, to be fair, this question of, well, what are the limits? Are there limits? What is the, maybe the church is right to say, look, we really shouldn't take sides here, but we're looking for peace and so on and so forth. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think first question is, what do we mean when we say the church? Does the church do this or that? Support, who? Who do we think? Do we refer by that? Do we mean the heads of the local churches? Do we mean bishops of local churches? Do we mean the clergy? Do we mean a lady? So I think this is because the church can mean different things, and one thing is to say how clerics react and how other people who are not clerics but are also the church, members of the church. There are many. One thing to say, it is historically speaking, big, well-established, institutionalized religious organizations everywhere, and there is absolutely nothing specific in that respect when it comes to the Orthodox Church. They tend to side overwhelmingly with the dominant power structures. Take the case of the West. Very hard to think of any examples where there was something going on where the church in those societies, the heads of those churches would actually openly come out in conflict, unless there was really a kind of a direct threat toward the church. But take the Protestant world. Traditionally, those churches are, first of all, integrated within the state and so obedient that they actually only what they do is to provide ideological justification for the established system, whether it used to be extremely oppressive or now with the liberal capitalist one. So this is kind of a standard story. Power structures love each other, support each other, as long as they don't become open enemies like Soviet Union and the church and stuff like that, or the Roman Empire going after the church. But even in those times, you can find theologians who had something nice to say about the Roman Empire. But you have many emancipatory movements and individuals throughout the history. Just a couple of examples, and then more you can find in Anarchy and the Kingdom of God. Uh, let's say everybody remembers Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, and he's standing up and against the emperor. Everyone can read John Chrysostom and his, let's call it social ethic, and his open attacks that are applicable 100% nowadays against the oppression that comes with wealth and privilege and all of that. You can think of holy fools in the Russian tradition as the manifestation of orthodoxy, sometimes, of course, romanticized, but even in this romanticization, you can find clear ideas when those who are believed to be somehow directly inspired by God and the Holy Spirit stand up and speak up against oppression, government, church oppression, church power structures, and so on. Think of something like 1905 revolution in Russia that was led, and the Bloody Sunday protests that were led by a priest. And Academy of Spiritual Academy of St. Petersburg was one of the centers for a different kind of, let's say, social ethics that led to these, partly led to those protests. So there are many of these examples, but it is also not something that institutions like to do for various reasons. The second question, or just the last one, in most recent one during the protest of 1996-7 in Serbia, in Belgrade, couple of bishops, including the patriarch, actually stand up and led the students out of, for example, ambush that the police was trying to set up and beat them. So you actually, this is you have both history, and it is also a very current thing. When it comes to the limits, I don't think we should be terribly prescriptive there. It's always dangerous to come up with simplistic models and then say, okay, that's by the way why I'm against those church documents that define the various ethics and something less. Most of them are completely either meaningless or useless. They try also to come up with simplistic models and then implement it. This is a bad kind of ideology. What we should look at is the context. There are extreme contexts when you cannot just, if you have a horror story like Nazi fascism in the 1930s and horrors happening there, it is, I think, a basic human and humane response to actually stand up against that, whether you're Christian or not, and do what you can under the circumstances to lower the level of suffering or provide some freedom. Different contexts require different means. In some societies where simply there is no the idea of secular religiosity that we have in the West, churches are just so integrated into the social texture of those societies that you cannot artificially make those boundaries as a general line, but also situations can dictate different approaches. I think it would be a good idea for the priests not to directly participate in party politics as representatives of, let's say, one ideological project against the other. They can do that, of course, as private citizens, but this might be divisive in situations when that is not necessary. However, I think there can be circumstances where even that kind of engagement, we have seen that in the history of the church, and I think it might be necessary, or people might see it at that moment in history and that particular place as the only justifiable way to respond to the crisis around them.
Yeah, and I don't know if I can throw my 2 cents in here. I think in both situations, they're very different, but when both situations, you do see a palpable movement towards a kind of authoritarianism. And it just seems to me that the church as an institution should discern that that's the point where it needs to kind of promote at least certain kinds of structures. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents. So we have about 5 minutes left. I just want to give you both a chance, maybe some final words, any kind of final thought or word before we kind of close it up.
Just one quick remark about speaking on this issue. In 1989, it was very mass protest in Georgia, but it was against Soviet Union. And I remember from the students of former Theological Academy, which was based in Tbilisi, that they were going to protest very active this such situation. And they had one professor of ascetics, I guess, even maybe in spirituality, but anyway. And he said to them, don't go to the protest, don't go there. And the question was, why? And what was the answer? If the God wants to change the government, he will change without you. And if he does not want to change government, why you go there? So he was trying by this way to stop students to protest against Soviet Union in 1989.
Yeah. Davor, any last thoughts or?
Well, I would just use the opportunity maybe to address one more question, because there have been a couple, and this is the last one.
There's a one by a Serbian student here. I don't know if you want to address, because the Serbian student gives another good example of interfaith solidarity. There was a blockade of the Serbian national TV, and it lasted through Easter. The Muslim students came to Belgrade on the day of Easter to help the students in Belgrade. But then the student asked, "You want to maybe read the question and address it?" Yeah.
Yeah, so the question is, an Orthodox and institutionalist perspective would suggest that the Orthodox churches support regimes in which they don't have an autonomous position from the government, especially clerics based within the country. Yet in Serbia today, there is clearly a growing number of priests and bishops who openly support the protests and speak against the regime. How can we explain this political behavior of the clergy, that those who support the protests?
And just very quickly, this relates a little bit to the question prior to that, where it says, "Is there a new generation of faith leaders that have emerged to the public in the pro-democratic protests?" So go ahead. Yeah.
That could be, yes. There are of course always new people and so on, but I'm never too sympathetic when it comes to this. So younger or older, you have smart people who are young and smart people who are old, and stupid people who are young and stupid people who are old. So like this, this division is just mostly meaningless, and it's also a capitalist trap, because you want to commodify everything, including the age and certain groups for profit-making purposes. So let's just talk. Is something constructive or not? That is, I think, much more beneficial. And I think yes, there is a growing number, since there is a growing number of Serbian citizens who are supporting the protests, or at least that used to be the tendency. I don't see any contradiction in the fact that there is a growing number of priests among those Serbian citizens who also support those protests. The problem is, of course, those who are either in certain deals with the regime or church structures that benefit from this proximity to the regime, and then it is difficult for them to actually stand up clearly and voice a message that would be different. And by the way, I don't think even that patriarch or bishops would be required to do that. It is they are also free to make up their minds and do what they think is the most constructive thing. I actually like the idea that this whole process and support from within the church is coming in the same horizontal and, let's say, democratic way from bottom,
Yeah.
from top.
Yeah.
I think this is good, because even when somebody supports you, that is a double-edged sword, because somebody can support it in order to manipulate for their own purposes and take over the narrative or come up as new leaders and so on. I think it is actually good that this is coming from below, bottom, lower echelon, so to say, of the clergy, mostly believers, citizens. They are articulating it, and I think this is the way to go.
Well, this has been really very, very informative and really, really illuminating, and very, very grateful to both of you for taking the time. And also, it's not a small thing. It's quite brave of you to both be here, because we know that in both of these regimes, people are watching what people are saying. So for that, we really thank you. Thank you for offering your perspectives. Your
system is watching us wherever we talk, whatever we say. So there is nothing unique about it. You are watched all the time.
Okay, so
have your cell phone.
Okay, yeah. So I'm being brave too, I guess. So I'll be. So again, thank you both very, very much. We thank all of you for joining us, for the questions. This will be posted on our YouTube website, our YouTube channel, in case you want to use it in some way for your classes or promote it to other people. It would be good to promote it, because it would be good to kind of get this information out to more and more people in the West, because it's really not being reported enough. And of course, I remind all of you about our website, fordham.edu/orthodoxy, and public orthodoxy as well. And for those of you who may be inclined, we invite you to perhaps even write for public orthodoxy. Both Guram and Davor have both written for public orthodoxy, and we're grateful for that. So again, during this Easter season, we wish you all Christos Anesti, Christ is risen. And thank you for being here. And again, Davor and Guram. And we wish you all a good summer, and look forward to seeing you all again at our programs for the next academic year. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.